Good afternoon, Sean.
Good afternoon, Bern.
Sean, let's get right down to it. This is one aspect of war which nobody ever wants to see or hear about, which is the death of children. A hospital in Ukraine has been attacked by a missile, deliberately or accidentally, we'll come to. But let's call it, Putin's in charge, so Putin has initiated this attack. It was part of a big set of missile attacks and one direct hit on the largest children's hospital in Ukraine. So I guess the first question is, before we get into the whys and wherefores, is what happened and what's the damage?
Well, I think let's start off by let's have a look at the video of this missile actually going in. Let's unpack what we've seen here. So 2 days ago, 8th of July, in fact, Russia conducted a wave of attacks using cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, Kinzhal hypersonic missiles across the whole of Ukraine, including a load against Kyiv. One of the targets that was struck was a children's hospital in the centre of Kyiv. Utter devastation caused to the hospital. And this is the largest children's hospital in Ukraine. It helps about 18,000 kids every year, many of them suffering from cancer and the like. Now, if Russia had deliberately targeted that, we'll come on to that, that will be in direct contravention of Article 19 of the Geneva Convention. And I'm pretty confident this will be properly investigated because of the evidence that's around there. There wasn't apparently any notice provided that this was going to come under attack, so there was no effort to minimise civilian casualties. Now, Russia immediately launched a whole wave of counter stories. First of all, they said it's partially a military hospital. Then they said it's a fully military hospital, but not providing any evidence to that. And there's a massive evidence this was just a children's hospital. They also then turned around and said, oh, well, it's the Ukrainian air defence missiles that have shot a missile down and the remnants fell onto this hospital. We've talked about that before, haven't we? I think the problem is, in a busy area like Ukraine, inevitably video footage comes out, and that's the footage we showed. And if we can get a slow-mo of it, it clearly shows a missile. Now, that missile is not tumbling. It hasn't got smoke coming from it. It hasn't been hit by something. It's not fragmented. It's literally on its final approach to its intended target. And when you do some recce on that missile, we can clearly show what sort of missile it is. It's a KH-101, doesn't mean anything to our viewers, but it's a Russian missile that's a staple of the Russian Air Force for launching. And it's clearly gone in to, therefore, its intended target. And Russia claims that these missiles go within a couple of meters of their intended target. So the evidence points very clearly to a Russian missile homing on its intended target that actually was a children's hospital.
Yeah, and I seem to recall that things like cruise missiles go relatively slowly in comparison to some other weapons that fly through the air, and therefore they can be seen on film quite clearly.
Yeah, no, that's why we've got this little bit of footage. It's quite difficult to see it going in unless you look closely, but we're slowing it down and we've got a freeze frame of it to show. We've got no reason to doctor these things. They're freely available on social media. Yeah. I think the point about these missiles and how easy it is to shoot them down, there is evidence that the KH-101 missile, this cruise missile, has been around for a few years. But there's evidence the Russians are trying to get it to fly lower and lower, because the lower you fly it, the more difficult it is to detect, and therefore seeing it come in. These things are normally subsonic, so they're going a few hundred miles an hour, but you can shoot them down. But I think it just raises the question for me, it looks like it was flying to its intended target. So why would Russia target a children's hospital?
Yeah. When they could imagine what the fallout would be. What's to be gained?
Well, the social media's gone alive with this because there are people out there saying, oh, well, it's clearly trying to damage Ukrainian morale of the people.
Yeah.
Do you think that would?
No, I think the opposite would happen,
Yeah. I mean,
actually.
yeah. It'll galvanise.
And there's enough evidence in Ukraine. I mean, nobody would have necessarily been able to predict this at the beginning, but one of the characteristics we've seen of Ukraine and its people is they get stronger with adversity, not weaker.
And therefore, it probably isn't that.
What's the guidance system?
So it's normally a GPS, the GNSS, I think it's called for the Russians, but it's a GPS, military GPS guidance system. So it would normally be pretty accurate.
Yeah.
But even if you were jamming it to push it off a bit, the jammers are only localized. They're not, and you normally have those protecting military targets. You wouldn't normally have them protecting a child's hospital.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, I mean, we've talked a bit about Russia is, like Ukraine, is short of weapons. So it's only got a limited supply, and most of these weapons are at least $1 million a pop to make. So Russia's trying to target energy infrastructure at the moment to stop Ukraine building drones, building weapons. It's also trying to target Ukrainian Air Force assets on the ground. Lots of evidence they've been wiping those out in anticipation of the F-16s arriving. They're also trying to provide missiles to support their front line. So it's not as if they've got spare missiles around. You'd imagine from a military perspective, they'd be conserving these missiles. And I guess there's part of me as a military guy that I struggle to understand why Russia would be deliberately targeting. A civilized society would not do it. It's against the Geneva Convention, and it's just not the right thing. It's not a legitimate target of war. But so much of the evidence here points to a weapon that guides to within meters of its intended target. The video footage shows that it wasn't damaged, shows that it was flying on its final approach path, and that's what it struck.
And what about the failure of the guidance system? Is that a known issue, or is it rare, or maybe unheard of completely?
Well, yes. I mean, the thing about guided weapons is that they either hit the target or miss by a long way.
Because they end up going somewhere else.
Yeah, because in really simple terms, the front end, you've got a sensor. It's normally a GPS guidance system. And the back end, you've got fins that fly the missile around. And if it's all working, it flies directly to its target. If it doesn't, then the fins fly it somewhere wacky. So if I drop a dumb bomb, no guidance system at all, it may not hit the target, but it'll normally go pretty close because it's just a ballistic bomb. These missiles fly themselves around. They have guidance systems. When we were delivering practice guided weapons onto ranges in the UK, the safety area was huge because when you launch these things, if one of the flying surfaces went hard over, it could fly a long way, and therefore you had to have a really big safety area. Whereas if you're just dropping dumb bombs, you can have relatively small range because you only release them very close to the target and they're not going to go anywhere. So yes, if it goes wrong, it would normally go wrong a long way away. And this again didn't look like a missile that had suddenly gone errant. It was on a flight path, was exactly as you'd expect to see it.
And presumably, people will now be able to track that missile from its source.
They'll be able to work out,
see exactly what the trajectory was.
Yeah,
and follow its path. So they'll be able to tell whether the intelligence system on this missile seemed to be in order and was functioning, or whether something was going crazy.
Yeah, it's just, but I just can't work it out. I just, and just the morality of war, the law of war means that, sometimes we reported that, a school's been struck. When you actually look at it, there aren't kids at the school, and it's quite possible that those school areas are being used for military concentrations or for storage of weapons or whatever. We don't know. On this particular one, on the evidence that's available, it's evidently killed a lot of children. It's evidently displaced loads of, kids suffering with cancer who, like you, no hair, but in their case, it's because of the treatment for cancer. And it just feels just an absolute travesty that these sorts of things can happen. The laws of war are meant to stop this sort of thing happening. It's a very sad day.
Very sad. Sean, it's that time of year, the NATO conference. It's actually the 75th anniversary. Everybody's going to be there. Our own UK Prime Minister is going to be there. And his wife is going with him as well. What do we know about what they're going to be discussing? Now, I have to be honest, ordinarily, prior to the wars that we've now got going on in the world, I wouldn't take these things seriously. They turn out to be big jamborees, a lot of champagne sipping, canapes, caviar, big dinners, good time. They fly back 5 pounds heavier and nothing actually has been achieved. On this occasion, there are some very serious things happening in the world from a conflict point of view, and indeed in America with a big election just on us. So what is your take on what they'll be discussing and what they should be discussing?
I share an element of your scepticism, certainly fine. But I do think if you go back 10, 15 years, NATO had sort of lost its way a bit. We were in the middle of a peace dividend. NATO had won the Cold War, for want of a better word. And, you know, what's it all about? Well, in the last year or so, you know, we've seen NATO expand. We've seen a much clearer role for NATO. We've seen a much greater urgency. And therefore, I think this summit in Washington will be a really interesting one. I think not only have they got, you know, what do they do about the war in Ukraine? It's not going well for Ukraine. You know, what more should NATO do? What are the risks involved in doing that? I think that's very clear. I'd also think that, you know, how do you bolster NATO's military credibility? It's not just about nuclear weapons, it's about conventional capability, which frankly is a fraction of the size it was during the Cold War. And it feels like it needs to be back at that sort of level. We've still got less than half of the NATO members paying their way. In other words, meeting the 2% margin. I suspect that will be on the agenda. And I also think what will be on the agenda is that balance between how much nations focus on their own national military capability versus their role in the alliance. So, for example, if you wanted to only be a good team player in the alliance, you might focus all of your efforts on having lots of fighter jets. That might leave you really vulnerable in other areas, but you are NATO's number one priority. Or do you make it completely national and you've got a mishmash of bits? I think there's lots of things, but my real worry about this one is that none of that really important stuff
Will be the story.
What will be the story?
Quiet Joe Biden.
And I struggle with this one, but because ultimately it's not our politics, it's US politics. Where the rubber hits the road for me, though, is that the US is the most powerful military nation in the world. The commander-in-chief of the most powerful military organization in the world is President Biden. And at the moment, there are questions being asked in America about whether, you know, he's fit enough to stand for another 4 years. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if many of the NATO nations, if not all of them, are putting a microscope over President Biden because, you know, this is emboldening President Xi of China. It's emboldening President Putin if they believe that the West is showing signs of weakness. And I just, again,
it could take the gloss or the emphasis off it because there's somebody at the podium giving a probably quite important speech, you know, outlining from their point of view what their own countries or their own view of the NATO responsibilities currently ought to be. But the cameras will be on Biden, watching to see whether he's fallen asleep or something. And that won't be helpful.
Ensure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the with the COVID. With dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat
No, and I do think it's an interesting reflection on we've just been through an election in this country. The US has got one coming up in November. But, it does feel from this side of the pond as if, is that really the best, the most powerful nation the world can put up on the world stage? President Biden's been an outstanding politician. They are, all the presidential candidates, all the presidents have done a genuinely superb job in difficult circumstances. But it's very difficult not to see a degree of vulnerability at the moment. And I don't know how you solve that. I don't know, in a nation as big and as powerful, because I know you're a bit of a fan of one of the other candidates out there, aren't you?
Well, I quite like Kennedy. I mean, I'm one of these fortunate people, I say, in that I don't have a fixed view on politics, so I'm neither left, right, or centre. But I try and find somebody who I believe is going to represent the current situation as best as they possibly can. So I quite like what Kennedy is saying at the moment. But I think, I don't want to get into the politics, but am I allowed an opinion? I think the Democrat Party have got only themselves to blame for getting themselves into this mess, because it has been obvious for a long time that President Biden is struggling. Physically and mentally, he's struggling. They all saw it. They basically covered it up. The mainstream media have not reported on it. In fact, they've done the opposite. They've tried to pretend everything's fine. Now, of course, it's sort of fallen off a cliff and they've got nowhere to go. And the more they're now attacking him because they say he's got to go, the more they attack him, the more Biden and his wife digs their heels in and comes out, slinging, which makes it doubly difficult. Very soon they've got to make a final decision. If they try and get him out, it's not a straightforward process. A lot of people have paid money. A lot of money into the Joe Biden campaign. A lot of people might be saying, sorry, I want that money back. Who do you put in his place? Is there somebody ready? If he carries on and fails, then Kamala Harris will have to take over. And I can tell you, nobody wants Kamala Harris in. So they could have actually sorted this out a long time ago, and they didn't, and they're paying the price at the moment.
Yeah, one of the things I think is just a shame, isn't it? I wonder history might be fairly unkind on this era, because I think where is the great hope, the JFK of its day, the Tony Blair, of his day, whatever your politics might be, Tony Blair managed to inspire a nation and delivered a landslide. Because he offered a ray of hope. He was a young voice. He was energetic, passionate, and isn't that what we need from our leaders? And I just wonder whether, particularly going back to the NATO summit, NATO and military capability is all about deterrent. I don't mean big D nuclear deterrent. I mean little d, mass military capability, and most importantly, the commitment to deploy it and use it if it needs to be used. An incredibly difficult decision to make. You need a robust character, clear thinking, who's able to engage and provide that level of analysis and robustness and intellectual rigor, because there couldn't be a more responsible decision to have to make. And we're members of NATO. We rely on that. And that's where it all comes to sharp focus for me.
Well, I think the world, no matter which side of the various conflicts you're on, the world wants to see something sensible coming from this NATO conference. Our own full General Sanders has put his oar in just about the right time, asking for, so we're on just above, 2% at the moment. Labour Party has said we'll go to 2.5% when we can afford it. Sanders is saying, well, I think we should go to 3.
I think we're going to get onto the sort of UK approach to this in a minute, but I think the NATO, what's fascinating is I wonder how those countries that aren't paying their way, there's even a debate coming on at the moment that it's not about the amount of money, it's about your contribution in kind or your whatever. Some nations are poorer, they have less money to spend. And yeah, hang on a minute, that's why you do a proportion of GDP to try to spread the load. And if there isn't a solution, the danger is, I think, you're going to see President Trump, if he is elected, going, Europe, That war is on your doorstep. You deal with that. I'm going to keep my eye on China. And we've already seen a little bit of Europe sort of stirring around, potentially looking at a European army.
Yeah.
And that makes me shudder, because I sort of think,
too.
oh, for goodness sake.
Yeah.
But I think it's inevitable. If so, going back to your original point, I don't think this conference is about gin and tonics, dining well, coming back 5 pounds heavier. I think there's a lot.
There is,
a lot going on at this one. And my worry is that it all gets shrouded around the state of a president, rather than actually dealing with the really difficult issues that it's got to deal with.
So let's dig a bit into the General Sanders intervention. So headlines from him were, firstly, we're not ready. And secondly, we need to up the amount we spend, 3%. And we know that money's only really a tiny, tiny part of getting the overall effect that you want from a defence point of view. What do you make of what Sanders has said?
A lot of the media have picked out that we should be fearful that we're not ready to go to war, woeful state of the British Army he's particularly focused on. I think it's worth setting context, though, first of all. First of all is that I started my career in the Cold War era. We were spending a lot of money on defence, 4 or 5%, and we'll come on to that. But we were also doing big exercises regularly. We were doing tactical evaluations every year run by NATO, massive exercises. Every 2 weeks, the phone would go in my quarter at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'd have to have my bags packed and be in work within the hour. There was all these call-outs. It was a very different philosophy. Cold War ended, peace dividend. Rather than wars of national survival, we were into wars of choice. And therefore, you pay an insurance premium for defence. We decided to pay a smaller premium. You have a smaller standing military. So the military is very good for what it was asked to do. The danger is the world has changed. And I think the challenge here is what Sanders was saying was that I know there isn't any money, but actually that doesn't change the security situation. And the question then becomes is, are we ready? And we've just heard from the new government that there's going to be a defence review. No surprises there. When's that going to be conducted? In about a year's time. Or it's going to be brought to conclusion about a year's time. When will that be implemented? About another year's time. 2 years from now. Does it feel like we have 2 years to sit on our hands before we start to change the preparedness of our nation for war?
Well, that just gets us through the SDSR process. Then you've got to start to wind up either additional manufacture of the technology you've got, or what we hope is the development of new technology. And the system is not good at getting that done quickly. So actually the 2 years could equally turn into 4 in terms of getting this capability up to the level that Sanders was critical of what it is now. And you'll know that even if you spend the money on all the equipment you've just described, actually getting the military capability up to that level where they're able to operate in this new world is tough.
Well, it's also because, even if you could suddenly double the size of the military overnight, I'm going to turn the money tap on. Industry, you were in that, start delivering. And might be 2 or 3 years before they delivered. But actually military capability isn't about equipment. It's about equipment, people, logistics, and everything else. If I turn the recruiting tap on today, hypothetically, I want to double the size of the British Army. How many people can they bring in each year? They're currently configured to train 10,000 a year. And they lose about 10,000 a year. So they've got enough trainers and whatever. So if you suddenly surge that to 20,000 a year, you haven't got the instructors to do that at the moment.
Massive hit on the system.
You haven't got the logistics, you haven't got the uniforms, you haven't got the guns, you haven't got the dental facilities, medical facilities. So even if you
could, bullets,
no, exactly,
all the things that you need.
So even if you could do that, that would gain you 10,000 a year, and you need how many? Another 70,000. That's 7 years, even if everything goes from day one before you've doubled the size of the army. These things don't happen quickly. The people part of it is a major challenge. And so I just worry that we feel like we're sleepwalking into something here. I accept the arguments that we can't suddenly go to 5%, even if, GDP spending, even if we had the money, would industry be ready to accept that sort of money? I doubt it at the moment. But philosophically, we're not ready. We don't have our when I was in the Cold War, we had massive big exercises, divisional level. Today, there's nobody in the army today, because it's about 34 years ago. Most careers are about 34 years long, even the seniors. So virtually no experience of large-scale Cold War NATO operations exists in the military today.
I know we're starting from a low base, because at every level, things have been cut back to the bone. So you go on exercises, and you're rationed on the number of live rounds you can use. Well, you need for lots of reasons, what you do this end of the gun and what happens at the other end needs a lot of practice.
Well, it's also the language. I mean, you've been involved in we used to talk about redundancy, because in the Cold War, the enemy knows where your bases are, so they're going to target them. So you need to actually disperse. You need to have lots and lots of supplies, because some of them are going to be taken out. Post-Cold War, this was all about efficiency. It was all about leaning. It was about just in time. And if you had redundancy, that was expensive. So today we have nearly all of our air transport assets on one base. We have all of our Joint Strike Fighters on one base. We have all our Typhoons on two bases.
Yeah. And actually, it is going to be tough for the Labour government, because I detect, just a guess, but I detect, sort of reading between the lines, they didn't really want to get, well, they didn't want it to get into a debate about how much to spend on defence. In the end, they had to say 2.5, but when we can afford it. 2 years through the SDSR, you've then got the sort of winding up the industry and getting all the capability stuff going. That could turn into, 4 years, as we've just discussed. By then, you're facing another election, and you can kick the can down the road, because what we're talking about is a lot of money. And I can tell you that I don't think there's money in the budget to do it. Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer does not want to put taxes up. So at every level, I think this is tough.
I agree, but we're both sort of pragmatists, because we've been around a few years. And I think, so is the option, there is no money, so we do nothing. I think there's a different language to approach defence around. We have, in the sort of post-Cold War era, the peace dividend, we've gone for exquisite capability, because we've wars of choice. So we want to go in there with the best weapons we possibly can. If you're doing a war of national survival, suddenly quantity becomes almost as important as quality. So you now need to have lots of less capable but more volume of stuff. And therefore, it feels like there's some choices that could be made now that might not necessarily suit our big defence primes that are orientated towards providing those exquisite capabilities. And maybe we need to be looking at more volume. Technology, at the moment, I don't really see the Ministry of Defence procurement process being agile and able to embrace technology swiftly. That's not the way it's configured. Whereas everything in the world out there is moving apace. Drone technology, everything.
Right, and are we able as a nation to respond to that speed? And when you've got big systems that have been built up with the infrastructure to cope with a certain way in which the world works, it's actually quite tricky. One of my businesses was around when the internet came out, Sean.
That's a long time ago.
And I remember in our business, the internet was going to do major damage unless we got it right. We literally had to throw away parts of our business, which we knew if we didn't would drain our dollars away for nothing. So we had to take a decision to kill that and build something new. And sometimes in business, and defence is a business at the end of the day, sometimes you've got to do that. So maybe we're looking at radical choices that need to be made.
Well, it's also just things that, for example, training. I think we are going to rely more heavily on alliances, inevitably, because we won't be able to afford to do it all ourselves. If you're going to train with alliances, it's really difficult to do that in the live world, because it's the cost, the risk, whereas doing it in the synthetic, the simulated environment, I've said before, I died many times in a simulator to avoid having to do it for real. But networking that so we can actually train as an alliance. We used to work in software. A lot of this stuff, I remember being told by somebody in defence, or linking your tank simulator up with my tank simulator around the other side of the world is really difficult to do. There's time lags and it's just difficult. I went home that weekend and I watched my son playing Xbox Live, talking to people the other side as he was doing a first-person game.
Kids do it all the time.
And you went,
Yeah.
Hang on a minute.
Yeah.
So I do think that dual-use technology, how you harness some of this innovation, academia, and how do we create a Team UK approach around this so that the model we can potentially export as well. So it's not just good for us, it's good for our exports. Because let's be clear, defence is going to attract a lot more money in the next few years. And it's not just our money. Russian exports used to fuel a lot of, meet the demands of a lot of customers. And a lot of those customers have looked at what Russia's doing and gone, actually, it doesn't work as well as they say it's worked. And they've turned to the West. So there's huge potential here to avoid spending a lot more money, but just being smarter about the way we do business.
I hope we can. My fear is that if you spent your whole life building hammers and somebody comes along and says, you know what, we don't need nails anymore, I've got another idea. You go, well, actually, maybe we do need nails because the thought of doing something different is just too awful.
I think it's going to be a fascinating one to see, because over the next 2 years, it feels the clock's ticking. And Putin isn't hanging around waiting for us to prevaricate to make a decision.
Sure, let's move to something I find fascinating. The Ghost Army. So a little while ago, Ukraine's managed to take out on Russian territory one of Russia's prized planes with a drone. And we now hear that Russia's managed to do the same to Ukraine. But there's a problem. What's the problem?
Well, it's been an interesting one because, as you say, Russia, over the last few weeks, there's no doubt, has been intensifying attacks against the Ukrainian Air Force. Why? One, to stop it getting involved too much in the war, and B, probably to demonstrate to Ukraine that when those F-16s arrive, we'll be targeting them. And they hit a Ukrainian airfield, and they had a Russian drone watching this, saw the explosion, and we can show all of that to our viewers here. And they almost immediately said, look, we've attacked and destroyed another Ukrainian fighter jet. They're vulnerable on the ground. It's not just them that can attack us. This time round, though, the Ukrainian Air Force commando doesn't normally say anything, made a public statement that said to the Ukrainians, in effect, don't believe everything you see. Not all these targets are real targets. And all of a sudden, if you look at the explosion, normally if you hit an aircraft, you get lots of secondary explosions, the fuel tanks going off, any ammunition that's on, the instruments. There's just lots of stuff that explodes on an aircraft. This particular explosion didn't have any of that. And it resonates back to the Second World War, where the Allies invested in a ghost army, a whole load of inflatable tanks, inflatable armoured personnel carriers, military machinery, and wooden aircraft that were made to look like real aircraft.
And fake countryside.
That's right. They used to dig tracks, didn't they, to show where the tanks, so you had this little blow up. And these things were really light. They just flip them over. It appears that Ukrainians are doing exactly the same thing. Now, what's really clever about this is that Russia is a major superpower. It's got satellites, nice sunny day, looking at the airfields, see an aircraft, phone up the missile blokes, put these coordinates in.
Go for it,
schwack. Hee. We've taken out a Ukrainian asset. Or is it? Because why would Ukraine leave its air assets in the open
on for display?
And
why would the guy announce that that's what's happened? Isn't that sort of giving the game away?
It is a bit, but I suspect the conjecture was he was doing it for a domestic audience because this was much advertised by the Russians, and therefore the Ukrainians might think, oh God, we're losing these aircraft. And I think as a degree of reassurance to the Ukrainian people, I think there was an element of, don't worry, not everything is as it seems.
Yeah.
And as a military analyst, I look at it and go, the Ukrainian Air Force is less than 100 fighter jets. If you knew that they were going to have an impact, you'd have a massive campaign. We did it at the start of the Iraq War. We said, right, if it flies, it dies. And there's no doubt Russia would want to do the same. But Russia doesn't have many missiles. It wants to conserve the missiles it has. Every one of those missiles that can be used to take out a decoy is a wasted missile. And that Ghost Army, that project was so sensitive that it was 50 years after the war.
Is that right? Before
people were allowed to talk about it. So it was a major deception campaign. And it just makes you wonder, let's not write off the Ukrainians too early. I suspect if they're doing that deception against Russian missiles, I wonder what else they're doing. But it's an old idea, 80 years old, being used apparently very effectively today.